So welcome, everyone, to our second ever Summer Something. This is the ASA Brown Bag Lunch Talks that we're pioneering this week. This is our chance to hear from women and men of faith who are navigating their careers in the natural and social sciences as God has called and gifted them. Today we're dipping just a short way into our archive to retrieve another audience favorite talk from last year's annual meeting in Wheaton. But more than just listening to a talk of these brown baggers, we have with us today in person Dr. James Sherley. And so welcome, James. Glad to see you there. Let me give you some background, some ground rules here. We call these it's park rules. Like if you're in a baseball, right? This is our baseball park. So here's the kind of things to think about. I hope you've got some refreshment close at hand. This is Summer Something. COVID upset us and we couldn't do anything face to face, but we could do something. So there you go. And it's a pretty casual time. So enjoy that as we go along. Please be sure to keep your mic on mute today. Our technical operator, Mark McEwen, will be doing that, but you can just do that. However, you can feel free to type questions and greetings into the chat. I'll be monitoring that as we go along during the presentation. If you've not met James in person before, you're in for a treat. He's not only a gifted researcher, but he's a passionate advocate for the unborn and a mentor for emerging and high school and university scholars. James, as you will hear today, has learned to be an effective witness in one of the most challenging conversations of our day, how to navigate the racial divides that ensue in the sciences and in the church, right across our society. Right after hearing his talk, he and I will join together for a live Q&A. So remember, you can type those questions in. And James has said to me, we'll make sure we get an answer for everybody. You may not get them all online today, but we'll have a chance to follow up and answer your questions. When we first met James last year, we heard his academic credentials. He's a Harvard undergraduate with a BA in biology, an MD and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and then a whole host of awards and other list of things behind him. But Dr. Sherley is the first in his family, as we learned, to go to school, to go to university. And James, I walked that pathway a number of years ago, and I think some people in our audience have walked that. And so you're talking out of that today, and that's really interesting to hear. James is an award-winning scientist. He's a founder and director of Asymmetrics, the Boston-based life sciences company. It's focused on developing stem cell enumeration technologies to advance the effectiveness of stem cell treatments and therapy in medicine. He's got a portfolio of patents behind him for various, that are really vital in this field, this emerging field of stem cell therapy. Yet, as you will hear, James really has a passion for people as well as for research and discovery. He finds time to be an active mentor with emerging young scientists and helping to guide them into that next generation of activity. Join me now as we are privileged to listen to a portion of this 2019 address by James, Living a Scientist's Life.
I want to start off by just saying thank you to the organizers of the meeting to give me this opportunity to share with you this morning. I want to give a special thanks to the ASA members out at the Boston Roundtable who I think kind of orchestrated me having this opportunity. And I'm going to share with you today personally because it's a rare opportunity to do this in this setting around the thing that I've spent all my life doing, which is being a scientist. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I want to tell you too that when Robin sent me the email invitation for this, She told me in the email and in our communications that I could talk about whatever I wanted to, but she suggested to me that I talk about my life as a scientist, as a Christian. And I've not had that opportunity to do that publicly before. And so at first, I have to say, I was like, I don't know. But the Lord guided me in this, and I'm convinced that the right thing to do is what I'm going to try to do today. I don't know where this is actually going to go, because I'll just tell you, when you review your own life for the sake of sharing it with others, you go over some grounds that were joyful and some grounds that were painful. And so I hope I can get through this okay today. So far, things are going all right. All right, so the topic of my sharing this morning is living a scientist's life. The scientist's life I'm going to tell you about is my own. And I do want to tell you from the perspective of what it's meant to be a person of faith and to become a scientist as well. And I'm hopeful that this one life will have relevance to all the lives that are here and the ones that you touch. I think it will, because we're all in the body of Christ. And because of that, I'm sure that there are going to be some issues that I've encountered that will resonate with you. But I'm a unique person as you're unique people, and there'll be some things that may not be so familiar, but that's an opportunity again for us to share. I particularly have been planning this talk for the 40 or so young scientists that are in this room. And I hope that it'll be helpful to you in terms of thinking about how to negotiate whatever the advantages and the challenges you have in your own careers as you move forward in science. I want to start with born. And if you've had an opportunity to read my abstract, I say at the end of it that I was born to be a scientist. Now, I want you to understand that there's sort of two aspects of that. One of them is general. I'll tell you about that in a minute and how I think about it. And the other one is specific, is how I came into being a scientist. And it's important because how I came into being a scientist reflects the Christ in my life. And my early support as a scientist is in the environment of the church. But let's talk about the general first. It is the nature of being human beings to be scientists. We all start off understanding and learning about our world by investigating it, experimenting with it, drawing conclusions about it, and then testing it. You all discovered gravity before Einstein. You ever heard of Einstein? Right? We've all seen small children push things off of tables or their feeding trays and watch it fall. They discover that. And then they learn that they can actually do operant behavior training, right, by doing it and have somebody keep picking it up for them. And then after that, they discover that they think then, things are pretty predictable here. If I push this off, dad or mom or sister, brother is going to pick it up and put it back up here. Gravity is reversible, right? And then they learn that the world is not predictable, because at some point, the person picking it up stops doing that. And maybe even takes the toy away, right? So so the difference between everyone and those of us who are trained in this profession is twofold. One, we have this special training. We spent learning how science, the codes of science, the practices of science, we understand that, we practice, apply it. And then the other thing is that we're about the business of discovering new things about the world, right? But human beings understand the scientific method inherently in our humanity. It's the gift that God has given us. But we're about making the world, the knowledge, bigger and more involved and understanding it. Now, my birth as a scientist comes from both what I actually remember and also what I've been told about when I was a kid. Right? So my parents were sharecroppers on the farm, the Pearson's farm in Memphis, Tennessee, outside of Memphis, Tennessee. And we picked the cotton fields there. And when I was a small boy, I still remember going to the cotton fields with my mother. we were given these grocery bags, and we're supposed to be picking cotton too. It's just to keep us out of trouble. Me and my sister, who's 2 years older, were about 3 or 4 years old at that time. And so I wouldn't pick any cotton. My bag would be full of insects. And I tried to take them into the house if my mom would let me. That's who I was then. Now, there was a big oak tree in front of our house, and that oak tree had carpenter ants in it. And when I was, again, about 3 or 4, I used to go out and squat and watch the ants. And the ants would discover me as I discovered them. And I'd invariably get ant stuck to my neck, biting me on my legs, and I'd run to my mom, and my mom would pick them off. And she got kind of tired of this behavior of her child, and she would say to me, "Stay away from that tree." And what my mom's younger brother, Uncle Charlie, used to tell me is that my grandmother said, "Ruby Lee, leave that boy alone. He's going to be a scientist." That's the first I'd heard of that. And from that day forward, I am the scientist in our family. Everyone knows that about James. And I just want to tell you that that oak tree for many years stood there. And I would come home after I started college, and I would drive by, and the houses that used to be there and the cotton fields that used to be there was gone, but that oak tree was there. Now, in addition to that oak tree, about 3 or 4 miles away, at the end of the cotton fields, was a church called the Oakville Missionary Baptist Church. And I've been told that when I was a young child, my mom used to put me on her hip and take my older sister Josie by the hand and walk that 3 to 4 miles to go to church every Sunday. And that church is a part of my entire life. From my birth until we moved away to the city. My father got a job as a cement mason, but we've always been a part of Oakville. And Oakville is still there. And I'm still a member there. It's the one place where I have a church membership is at my home church at Oakville. And at Oakville is where I was really nourished toward a career in science. My pastor was a chemist, and I got all of his support around James as a scientist. We just put on these African-American history pageants. I was George Washington Carver. Right. So my science starts in the church, was supported by the church from the very, very beginning. So what I want to turn to now, I'm purposely getting ahead of myself. I want to tell you about the scientists that, as I look back, that represent the role models, if you will, the visions for me to become a scientist. And these are probably the most important names I think about right now, and I just want to go through those. So Carver is George Washington Carver, and as I said growing up, the only scientist I knew about was George Washington Carver. I discovered him in 4th grade reading a biography about him, and I don't remember about the science that he was supposed to do. What I remember is that he was taken away from his mother because of slavery at the time. He was separated from his mom. His mom was taken away from him. That always sort of stayed with me. Now, I've heard since then, as I've gotten older, that George Washington Carver, maybe his science wasn't sort of all that. But what I think was most important about the work of George Washington Carver is that he showed that black people could be scientists too. You'll see why that's important for me. Now, you probably don't know Josie as a scientist. That's my older sister. She's 2 years older than I am. She always did everything first. I can remember when she first went to school and I couldn't go, I cried because I couldn't go. But she's the one who really got me focused on what path in science I was going to take, because she came home when she was in 6th grade. She had taken a health class, and she had learned about these invisible organisms called bacteria. And I still remember my amazement. She was like, "James, they're everywhere. They're on your skin. They're in your mouth. They're in our food. Bacteria, bacteria." It's like, "How do you see these bacteria?" She says, "Well, you have to get something called a microscope or something." And I decided in that moment that I was going to grow up and study bacteria. And when I left for college, many years later, I went to college to become a scientist, a microbiologist. Right? So Josie has really been a very important person in my life. She's an avid reader. The reading I learned to do was because of following her lead. Now, Just is Ernest Everett Just, black marine biologist, lived at the turn of the 20th century. I didn't discover him until my time as a scientist when I was actually going to MIT. My wife's godmother got me a book that was written by this person, this author, Kenneth Manning. It's a biography of E.E. Just, Black Apollo of Science. I'll come back later and tell you why that's significant for me, but it turns out that Manning was at MIT. I met him there. He ended up being an advocate for me. The life of E.E. Just, 100 years earlier, as far as I can tell, looks just like my experience in science. Right? And then finally, on this list of importance for me is Thomas Kuhn. If you haven't read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I encourage you to do so. I discovered this book in a trash bin. I was helping one of my graduate school friends move. He was moving on, and in his wastebasket was this paperback book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution. I said, Phil, why are you throwing this out? He goes, oh, I don't need it anymore. I says, well, can I have it? And I'll tell you, I have this thing about books. I can't stand to see them being thrown out. If I'm walking by a library and I see a stack of books there, they're going home with me. I'll look at them later, and I've got a lot of those kinds of stray books at home. But I picked that book up and I put it on a shelf, and I didn't look at it until later in my graduate career when I was struggling with what I felt was the lack of acceptance for my new ideas. And a postdoc in our lab said, James, you should read Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You'll have a better understanding of what you're encountering. The new ideas in science, although we're about innovation, always have a tough way to go to acceptance. It's the nature of science, the way science moves forward. And that's been really helpful to me in another way that I'll come to later. So what I want to share, the theme of my talk today in terms of being a scientist and a person of faith, is tension between the two, science and religion versus synthesis. And the theme that I want to leave with you that I think that characterizes my experience as a scientist is the latter, synthesis, not the tension. Now, we heard some talk earlier here about this idea that science and religion are at odds, they're in battle, they're against one another. There's a long history of this problem between the church and science, but a lot of science has come out of the church. And what I submit is that, and I think a lot of people, which is what's nice about being here, is that there's no reason that science and religion have to be at odds with one another. They are both from God. There can be a synthesis of that. And I hope you'll see, as I take you through my experience, how that synthesis has come about. So that tension, though, did exist for me from the outside. So when I got ready to head off to college, there was this discussion in the Oakville Missionary Baptist Church about James and maybe forgetting about God when he went off to college. I was never concerned about that. And my father, who was associate pastor in the church, my Sunday school teacher, a very obviously important person in my life, wasn't worried about it either. We weren't concerned about it, but other people were. Folks went off to college, they came back, they didn't go to church anymore, and they lost their faith. This was a threat to us. So this idea of science versus faith was even worse for me going off to college, because I wasn't just going off to college to do anything. I was going off to college to become a scientist, to be critical perhaps of the faith. And again, I'll tell you, that has never really been an issue for me. And I think over time, the people in my church family who are concerned about it understand it doesn't have to be that way. Now, the one thing, sharing with the younger people here, that I did lose when I went to college is fellowship. If I look back at my life as a Christian and you were to ask me, what thing might you do differently? I think I would work harder at continuing the participation in the church family that I grew up with. But I tell you, when I got to Harvard College, I did not go to church for a very long time. I didn't lose my faith at all. My prayers, the way I think about the world in terms of God's role in it, but my participation in fellowship just went to zero. And it didn't come back. And when I look at that, I wasn't protesting. I just didn't go. It's easy when you're in the kinds of places I've gone for college not to go to church. I wonder what it would be like to be at a place like a Wheaton College, which I'm learning about. I wonder what that would be like. But when I had children, this became a very important concern of mine. And the way I put it is this. In my life, my religion was inherited. The people I grew up with, my parents, it is their world. And all of the children there, just as we inherited their genes, we inherited their faith. Yes, we grew up in the church with learning and education, but basically it was something that we started with. We didn't discover it. And I had not met people in the world who had not started that way and then discovered Christ. And as I thought about my children, the question was, should we bestow and let them inherit religion the way my wife and I had, or should we let them discover it? And we did something kind of in between, because we started going to church. And we joined the church family. And my kids got a chance to grow up in Sunday school. But as they got older and got into their teen years, we didn't make that a requirement as it was in my own home. We let them start to decide for themselves how they wanted to know Christ. We're available to them. We support them. But again, so now that the kids are out of the house and on their own, I'm back to where I was. Some of my difficulties with congregational church on a regular basis is that people are people. And, if you are a member of a congregation, you know that there are many challenges in terms of being a part of that. So I still struggle with finding the right church home. I love going back to my home church. Even this morning, the power of togetherness and fellowship is just an amazing thing. It always reaches me. But I still haven't figured that out. My wife is a church every Sunday, but she's not a member of the church which she belongs to. All right, so we still are trying to figure that part out about fellowship, but I know it's important. That's been a challenge for me. So what I want to turn to now is what I identify as the main challenges I've had as being a scientist in my scientist life, and also in being a scientist in my faith and how my faith has played a role. That's how I want to spend the rest of my time. So there are four aspects of this that I want to go into. One is life, the challenges of being a scientist and just being a person in your society. The other one is the profession, what the challenges I've met in terms of my profession as a scientist and as a person of faith. I can't give a presentation and not talk about my living in this country and the history of slavery and racism. So I want to share some of what the challenges have been to be a scientist and the racism that is around us. And of course, I want to spend a lot of time talking about the challenges of not maintaining, but expressing my religion, my faith, my belief in God and God's role in our lives as a scientist and in the scientist profession. So life. There are lots of challenges in life. We've all lived, so we know that's the case. And what I want to focus on now is not sort of the general kinds of issues that we confront as we move through life and as we move through life as Christians, but as being a scientist. And one of the challenges that I say I have had is that I'm always a scientist. The way I look at the world, whether we're talking about politics, or we're talking about finance, or we're talking about social issues, I approach it as a scientist. Curiosity, probing, criticism, wanting to understand. And so that can be a problem with people who don't understand that you're coming at it from that perspective. And so one of the things I have on this slide is my wife saying to me, I guess when our kids were maybe middle schoolers, do you have to be critical about everything? I don't know if you've gotten that or not, but I was like, what are you talking about? So, everything we say is always like, we got to go through this analysis. And I won't talk enough about Marion. I'm not here without her. But my wife said to me, she says, the kids they're not experiments, James. They're just two girls trying to grow up in the world. Stop analyzing everything about them. So this is a challenge because it's my nature. I think it's gotten me in trouble too in my profession. I like to think that I'm not judgmental, but I can be very critical of things. I want to understand them. Why is it this way? Why is it that way? And I know there are people in this room like that too. So you need some feedback on this so that you can kind of try to modify. And what I've had to learn over the years is, what's the audience I'm talking with? Is this a okay place to ask this kind of question or not? So that's been a challenge for me. It remains a challenge. Even in my own profession, I think sometimes when I first meet people, they think, oh my God, this guy just asked 1,000 questions. But I just want to understand. I want to know. I want to participate in the thinking and the exchange. And so that's been a challenge. The other challenge I've had is with family and friends, is that I'm not the ideal scientist that they have in mind. If you're not in this profession, you kind of think when science speaks, science knows, that's what you do. That's right. That's what it is. And we know that science is complicated and complex and nuanced, and we're not always sure. One of the examples I'd like to give is this. I used to teach environmental health science to undergraduates at MIT. I really enjoyed it. We talked about how do you determine whether or not something in the environment is causing a human health effect. Big, challenging problem. What I used to tell them is this. So here's the problem with scientists that you're going to encounter. You talk to the persons who are in the company who are doing the polluting in a neighborhood, and they tell you, we're sure that the toxins, not the toxins, but the compounds are not causing any health effects. We're sure of it. You talk to the people who are living there, and they are like looking at their kids get leukemia. They think their cancer rates are high, and they're saying, we're pretty sure that those compounds that they're putting in our environment are hurting us. And then you get the environmental health scientists, and you ask them what they think about it. And what do we say? I'm sure. I'm not sure, right? We can't tell you for sure. And that's not satisfying to anyone. But that is what science is like, right? When you do it well, you understand the uncertainties in the process. And when you talk with people who are not scientists and you say things like that, they think you're crazy. They think you're being evasive, or these questions that come up. One of the things going on right now in my neighborhood, you can imagine, is people talking about climate change, and they're asking me, I says, well, you don't vote in science, right? Just because there are 100 people over here saying it's this and it's one over here, that one over there may actually be the one who's got it right. So that has been complicated for me in terms of dealing with my, again, family and friends, because I tend not to just sort of say, yeah, science says it must be right. No, science says that we're using a different way of thinking about the problem or the issue, and we have to weigh that against other things, just like we weigh our science against our belief in Christ. We don't use it to say it is or isn't, or to try to falsify. We just recognize it as a different kind of way of dealing with knowledge. The last thing I want to tell you about my life challenges is something that has to do with becoming a scientist, because I have spent most of my life in the past, not in the present, but in the future, thinking about how to prepare for what's next in my scientific trajectory. Thinking about how what I do now is going to impact later. And I want to give you an example of how lost I was about this. I'm not going to tell you how many times I've gone out and talked to young students about, the 5 Ps: preparation, persistence, but also, planning for the future. So this is what changed me. Sitting at the dinner table one evening with my family. At the time, my oldest daughter, Esha, was about 7 or 8. We were just having a conversation. And then Esha says, "Oh no, not the F word again." This is our 8-year-old, right? I look at Mary and I go, what is she talking about? Do you know what she's talking about? Esha what's the F word? And Esha says, Dad, you say it all the time. You know what it is. I go, actually, dear, I'm not sure I know what it is. She says, future. All you talk about is future. Future this, future that. Why can't we just talk about now? The wisdom of children. And in that moment, I saw myself for what I was. Always tell me, you got to do this now for that. It's really important, students, senior people here, it's important to be in the present. There's a role for planning for the future, but it's in the present where we interact with each other. It's in the present where we share. It's in the present where we help and support. If we spend all of our time saying, I'm only doing this, what's going to happen later on, you've lost something really important. And so now when I go out and talk to students, I actually talk about this specifically, about being in the present. And as scientists, because we're always thinking about where it's going, it's very important, but we have to spend some time thinking about what's happening in our present as well. I want to turn to profession. And I put this way because this is my scientific life. All right? The two things that are there are inseparable as far as I can tell in my own experience. And the one that you can't really see as well is this one. Now, there are lots of ways in which people differ from one another. And human beings have gotten very good at treating others unfairly or discriminating against them because they're different than them. Races, and we won't get into talking about the scientific basis for race, but race is one of those differences. And I appreciate, and I've had some conversations here too, that there are lots of reasons why human beings are discriminated against one another. But what I want to submit to you is that this one in America is different. And the reason it's different, I think, and there may be some others like it, is because that type of discrimination and unfair treatment is based on questioning the humanity of the other. Right? This whole notion is that the way often humans oppress other humans and they justify within their faith is by saying they're not really human. They are subhuman. And in the history of science, scientists have contributed to that approach. Right? So racism, I think, especially the imperative of the history of slavery in this country, makes it something we really have to pay much more attention to because it does impact all of us. Now, what I want to do in this moment in talking about this particular challenge is to say the relevance here to my Christian faith is because of the things I've encountered in this country, because of my race, I would not have gotten through them without God. I would not have gotten through any of these things that I'm not going to tell you about if it wasn't for my faith in God. That has really made a difference for me. It's given me a different kind of understanding about this. It's helped with the pain, it's helped with the anger, all of those types of things. What it's meant in my profession, racism, is that I've encountered, so Michael gave you that list of all the wonderful opportunities that I've had, right? So if you look at my career on paper, it looks just like he must have really had a great time going through. But I assure you that what's missing from there is all of the nots, the no's, and the nevers. And they're just chronic. So I thought about this a lot, and I didn't really come to a conclusion this morning about how to share this, because I could just give you like one example after another, and some of you would say, oh my goodness, that happened? And others you would say, well, that could have happened to anybody, right? But I'm telling you that many of these things that have happened that I'm going to just share a little bit about are because of racism. Now, the racism I'm talking about, I mentioned Kuhn early on because talking about presenting new scientific ideas and going out and presenting, new data, new findings, there's going to be resistance. What I want to tell you and share with you is that the resistance that I have encountered is beyond that. Some of it I understand now is because people just not being familiar with a different kind of person, a different heritage coming forth with new ideas, but there's a certain level of distrust because of being different. And that isn't unique to racism in science, but that's beyond what Kuhn talked about in terms of just the natural process of science and the natural vetting process that takes place before new paradigms can move forward. The other thing is that I read E.E. Just. I got the book E.E. Just from my godmother when I came to MIT. I didn't read it until the protests against racism that I undertook at MIT. I read it in that moment. And the thing that just boggled my mind is that in many places I could just put my own name in there 100 years earlier and it would be the same. The things that Just encountered in terms of his ability to have his research accepted, to get positions to do that research, to find funding for it. So I want to share three things with you about my experience. I think some of you may be aware that I underwent a hunger strike for about 2 weeks at MIT to protest the racism in the denial of my tenure case. And I want to, emphasize that I'll emphasize it in this way. So if you ask me, what counsel did you take, James, before you decided to do that? Who did you talk with? Did you talk with your wife about this? Did you talk with your pastor? Did you talk with your father? I didn't talk with but one entity, and that was God. The only counsel I took in making that decision was in my faith that it was the right thing to do. My wife is still getting over forgiving me for that because she found out about it like everybody else when I announced it. And my faith told me that was the right way to proceed, and that's what I did. I have never looked back at that decision. So that's one thing about how racism has impacted me. The second thing is, what I didn't tell you in my journey at becoming a scientist, the thing that I've always wanted to be is an independent investigator. From the days when I wanted to come and be a microbiologist, I ended up being a cancer cell biologist. I just can't tell you how much my psyche is for being that. I love the interaction with students. The best people used to ask me, well, what's the best thing about being at MIT? The students. That opportunity to work with young minds and train and teach. So it's what I've always wanted to do. And what happened because of that protest is that I don't get to do that anymore. I've talked with some of you about what I do at Asymmetrics and how I enjoyed it and it's important to me and everything, but I don't get to do the thing that I always wanted to do. Now, the third thing I want to tell you about this is that the other thing that changed because of that protest is how I pray. So, I used to pray for things that I wanted, that I hoped for. God, please let this happen. God, please do this, God. And now my prayer is, God, give me the joy of following whatever path you put before me. Give me the strength to do the things and the understanding to approach them in the way you would have me to approach them. And that prayer really represents the fact that I learned from that experience, as my mom has always told me. She says, son, sometimes what you want is not what God has for you. And so it's really about, in my career now, saying that you never know what God actually has for you in mind, or if he's even thinking about what you're doing. But I hope to think that the things that I do and the way I proceed now, although I don't get to do what I wanted to do, are important that I'm doing what I am doing. So I want to move on now from that aspect of my life as a scientist and as a person, and I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the challenges of being a scientist with the faith that I have in God. And those are the elements that I want to go to. For me, as I said earlier at the beginning, it's always about the synthesis between science and faith. And I want to say this, so the roundtables that some of you participated in and the ones that we have back in the Northeast have been really a great place to have an expression of that. One of the challenges is this as a scientist. My thinking is, God gave us science. It must be okay to use it, even to ask questions about God. But as you know, certainly in my church back at Oakville, if you say, I wonder if I could do an experiment to figure out and show how God is in the world, people would say, what are you talking about? Don't you just believe? Faith is all you need. I agree. Faith is all you need. But that doesn't mean you can't have the intellectual exercise of asking a question. How would you go about, besides what we feel, what we believe, what we think, demonstrating the existence of God in the world? We've had examples of that with miracles in the past. God has done that for us. But I like that idea of apply the scientific method. Don't worry. We're not going to falsify the existence of God. That's not going to happen. We may discover something more about our world by taking our tools that we've been given and applying them. I really enjoyed the talk last night thinking about other aliens and Deborah's thinking about how that relates to our worldview here now. So that's something that I continuously think about, how does the science and the existence of God go together? Now, it may be, as I will agree, that maybe you can't really investigate God because God actually gave us the investigatory tool. Now, one of the issues that comes up is talking about your religion and is private versus public. So it's one thing to maintain your faith for yourself, within your church family, and your science. It's another thing to go out and talk about your Christian faith at one of your scientific conferences that isn't an ASA meeting. Right? We know those challenges that are there. And once you go out and you start talking in public about issues where science and religion play a role, the public arena can be a really kind of threatening place. Right? One of the things that I've seen is that in the debates I participated in around the science of human life and humanity, is that the moment a scientist, and it's been my experience, so I'll give you what it's like. You're in some kind of debate, you're discussing an issue, somebody from the audience, usually a reporter, says, "Isn't your father a Baptist minister?" Or, "Aren't you a member?" When that happens, the reason that question is asked, because then everybody in the room stops listening to anything you've got to say about science. That's something we have to change. It has to be understood that my faith does not mean that I don't practice a scientific method like everyone else and apply the same rules and requirements because I do. Right? It doesn't invalidate my contributions in the area of science because I'm a believer in God, in Christ. But I tell you right now, amongst many, when you talk about the fact that you believe in something that you cannot show and let someone else touch it and feel it the way you do, your scientific credibility, you can sort of hear it just plummeting. And so it's been a challenge for me to think about how to manage that. And I'll tell you that if you look at some of the things that I've written in these areas, I'm going to skip beyond science and humanity and go to negotiated moral versus ethical. And talking about how, based on science, we think people should behave about the treatment of individuals, the treatment of embryos, those types of things. You can talk in the scientific community about ethics, right? Because ethics is something that we agree upon, right? The ethic, it can be a good ethic, it could be a bad ethic. Thieves have ethics, right? We can define it. And if you look at the regulations about, again, the treatment of early humans and unborn children in the scientific regulations like NIH like that, they talk about ethical science. What's missing is moral science, right? What's hard to do is to bring to bear a foundation, a basis that's actually based on talking about what's good and what's bad, what's good and what's evil, what's right and what's wrong. But in our faith, we know that there is good and there is evil. trying to bring that to bear in scientific discussions is quite challenging. And one of the things I've been looking at is how to, so what I was going to say earlier, if you look at my writing, it talks about whether this is ethical or unethical. But in fact, what I'm thinking is whether this is moral or immoral. And trying to move that into the public arena is quite challenging. And it's something I think groups like this have to think about how to do that. So the science that I've really been participating in has to do with education around what is the nature of human life, its beginning and its end. And again, there have been challenges there and I say to people sometimes when I am involved in these discussions, I say, I want to talk about what we as scientists know. I want to be truthful about what we as scientists know. And then the public can make a decision about how it wants to behave or policies that are written based on that. But it's very challenging to also say in the same breath that I don't think God wants us to be doing what we're doing when it comes to how we treat fetuses and how we use fetuses for doing research and how we destroy embryos for embryonic stem cell research. I don't believe that is right. But what I've tried to do in the public arena is to say, let us make sure at least you're getting a fair and truthful statement about what we know as scientists about this. So I want to close with this slide here by telling you, I hope you take from my talk that I view my opportunity in life to be a scientist as a blessing. It's a very special profession that we partake in my life, and as I move forward, I want to continue to try to not talk about science versus faith, but science and faith. I wasn't aware of the ASA the way I'm becoming aware of it now, and gee whiz, I wish I knew this organization when I headed off for college. I really wish that. And I will tell many of my students about this. Scientists have a social responsibility because of our profession. We are the keepers of the tree of knowledge. We are the cultivators of it. All sorts of knowledge about how the world works. And although we started out by doing some things that God didn't want us to do in terms of eating from that tree, we are now its stewards. Many of you may be like me. I am trained. My education is paid for by the public. Scholarships, fellowships, and I feel a responsibility because of that to give back in terms of helping the public to understand what it is we do and why we do the things we do, and help inform the various processes that have to do with things that have to do with how we treat one another in this world. And so I come with the close that I aspire for moral science, a science where we can apply this tool, this wonderful approach to understanding the world, and do it from the perspective of what we think God would have of us to do. That there are appropriate and inappropriate things to do with our tools. Right? And if we can do that, problems like discrimination, unfair treatment, many of those will fall away as well. And the bottom line is, forget about the science. It's about putting God in our lives and what we do. So I want to thank you for the time and for your attention, and I'm happy to address questions and comments. I look forward to talking with you in the meeting, and let me just say, I'm available to you for these issues and others after I leave here. My email address, please reach out to me. I hope I will join and see you guys in the future, so God bless and God keep you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Once again, such a pleasure to hear your voice from just a year ago. I've been madly typing notes away to myself and remembering things that you said that I had forgotten. And all over my life, I hear going back to a lecture again and again is really helpful. It's like listening to old sermons. You get something more out of it the second time around. Well, there have been a number of questions coming into the chat, and I've been monitoring those along the way. And now we're going to take some time, James and I, to go back and forth. So, James, if you'll unmute your microphone as you have, thank you. And you're going to hear from the two of us going sort of back and forth on these questions. I'm going to start you, James, if we could perhaps start here with a question it's come up. Someone mentioned it in the chat. I think Mark Strand put this in. And maybe others are thinking it too. it's on all of our minds, given the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the eruption of violence and protest. But more importantly, I think the conversation that has opened up, both with our scientific colleagues and in the churches. Would you want to update what you've just said last year? Is there anything you want to add to that right now, just to begin with, in light of what's been happening?
So first thing I just want to say is hello to everyone. It's nice to see and reconnect with some of you, and thank you for the questions, which I sort of started addressing during the chat. I wrote that I didn't think it would be an update. It would be a continuation. Many of the things that have been going on lately, and I want to make one other caveat. Realize you're just hearing from one person. You're hearing about my experience. It's not necessarily representative. But many of the things for African Americans that are going on now are simply an intensification of our experience that's been going on for a long time. I myself, I'm somewhat puzzled, and I've actually in a couple of documents written by trying to understand why the intensity now. I know what is being said by the media and by people who I talk with, but what is it about this moment that has brought so much more attention to the issue of racism in America? I don't think we can ignore the fact that there are factors operating, such as the current problems with COVID, the current problems with our presidential administration. All of those things are factors as well. But I think the thing we do is maybe not spend so much time worrying about why there's this increased interest and intensification, and instead try to move the country to a better place because of it. So if there were going to be an update, I would say that some of the things which I didn't bother talking about specifically a year ago, they are certainly in our minds now in very, very specific terms. The other point I want to make is that what happened with George Floyd has happened to many others. And it is a very specific type of racial event. But racism is happening throughout our country. It's happening in boardrooms, it's happening in hospitals, it's happening playgrounds. And I think it's really about becoming more aware and starting to think about how do we, in our own day-to-day lives, minimize this problem that really negatively impacts us all.
Thank you, James. That's both for the caveat and for the comment, because it really echoes with me. Many of us as ASA fellows participated in the Cambridge Roundtable and talking about intellectual humility last night. And in the materials in the lead up to that was sent to us are a series of links to videos. And one of those videos is a group of Black pastors who were right there at the end of May meeting and commenting. And I'm going to say that you are a single voice, but here were 6 Black pastors and their life experience and their congregation's experience. They're reflecting exactly what you're talking about, powerfully. And I sat for an hour and a half and watched that, reminded that we're in a long conversation. When COVID struck back in March, I said to my wife, "Oh, it feels like the 60s all over again. The pressure's on and it is disruptive, and it just feels like those days." And little did I know that very quickly that civil rights issue was going to just erupt in our face again. And my first reaction was, my goodness, why didn't we do anything? And yet we're in this conversation. We have done, and there's so much more to do. So thanks for bringing that to us. I'm going to go to another question that's come in. This one from Mike Byler says, you mentioned your struggle to find the right church. So what problems have you encountered with various congregations? And this goes to the anti-intellectualism, the anti-science question. And there's some follow-ups to that. So,
well, it's pretty much resistance to what I talk about enjoying doing in my talk, which is thinking about God and how God works in the world more broadly, maybe even more in an investigative fashion. You don't get to do that in many congregations. I remember when I was a postdoc, my wife and I were attending a church in Princeton. The pastor was a pretty open, broad thinking kind of a man. And I asked him if I could start asking questions after his sermon. He said, absolutely not. So that's what I mean. Churches, it has an understandably necessary sort of dogmatic way that religions are presented and followed. So oftentimes there's no place in that church for you to ask that kind of question or have that kind of discussion. And if you start doing it, you start having challenges. The only other thing I would say, at least in my own, and this is my experiences primarily in the Black church, as I say to my wife, who I've told you guys is not a member of the church, but my goodness, the church becomes completely grown into your life. There's just such a demand on knowing and having every aspect of you be a part of that congregation. That's been challenging for me because of other requirements on my time and my thinking. So it's those types of things that have been challenging for me.
Very interesting. Well, at one point, right at the end, you mentioned the ASA as a group, and you were talking about ethical questions, and you say groups like this must think about how we enter into these challenging discussions, work toward getting a fair and truthful account out in the marketplace. And that's the other aspect. That's the other direction that we face. I think as I'm looking down across the screen and I see so many of my friends in the ASA who are in the audience today, but we found this place. This is we've had member calls in the last few months, and people again and again have affirmed that there's a need for an island of refuge, a place you can stand as both a scientist and as a believer, and feel the confidence that you can have a conversation. And of course, ASA is as you've discovered, right, is one of those places. So I'm wondering, as you've thought about this for a year, do you see some directions that you would send us as an organization, some things you think we might emphasize? And that's a kind of challenging question. I'll come back to some easier ones in just a second.
Okay. So since I'm a member now, I can actually say us when I'm talking about ASA. So groups like this, the real power they have is in enabling and building the confidence of its members, the coming together, the collective sharing, the powerful thing to have, and you have a long history of this. It becomes more challenging when you decide how you want to impact the rest of the world. It's a decision that we have to make as an ASA community, and that you don't do by just simply having your implicit culture. You have to do it intentionally. You have to think about what are the things in the world that resonate with what we think we're about that we can do that will improve the world. Maybe students in science, maybe, and then you rally your talent together and you start doing that. You make a plan to do something specific. You can't do everything. So the first question is, there's no point in it if the membership's not interested. So we have to start by asking the membership what's important to us. And that's going to change over time because the world is evolving too. But if you don't have a pretty good buy-in from everybody that is important to the organization, then it's hard to do things. So again, it's about starting the process of looking outside of where ASA is.
Yeah. Well, this is certainly important conversations for us for the diversity questions, and it's not just about race, it's about all kinds of diversity. Those are important questions, and there are issues that come at us from many different directions. So opening up and in this Zoom world that we have entered is one of the ways we might be able to do that. So I'm going to turn it back to this advice kind of question here. This is, how would you explain to a non-scientist the difference between expert consensus in science and taking a vote? I mean, the climate change is, of course, obvious, one of the places where that has become a real controversy. So what's the difference between expert consensus and taking a vote that science doesn't do?
How long it takes for the process to happen, right? We can decide right now we're all going to vote on something and take the outcome, and that's going to be it. But science consensus is something that just happens over time, and it can change. So it's an evolution process, and I think we all know it in our various fields. If you look at where ideas were some time ago and where they are now, there's this evolution that happens. And consensus is, it's contextual. But in any moment, if we wanted to, if we're at a meeting, for instance, we decide to have a vote. The problem with voting in science is nobody accepts votes as the basis for us deciding what's most likely to be supported by data. It isn't the vote, it's the other things that make that difference. So. But I think one of the points I think I try to make in the talk is that a lot of folks out in the rest of the world add up what scientists are saying. They actually do some type of accounting to say, well, I'm hearing hundreds of people saying this, I'm not hearing very much of that. And the media is a filter. Those are more, again, voting, and science just really doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At least in my opinion.
Your opinion. That's what we're asking today. But the key here then is, and somebody else followed up with it. So what if the scientists, are reaching a consensus, but what if they're fundamentally wrong? And this is really that Kuhnian question, right? That you got at. Do you want to say anything more about that in your experience? Because I know you've had firsthand experience with pushing up against this kind of boundary.
Yeah. So again, if you talk about science happening in a small part of a field where there are a few investigators, these problems are not so important. They have a way of working themselves out over time because everybody's playing fair. Everybody's listening to what people are discovering. There's discussion going on. And one person in a system like that, who originally is the one with the idea that is new, with time, the way Kuhn talks about it, because of what's really happening in the world, it can evolve to a better representation of the world. But the things you talk about, the politics of science and like the media, climate change right now, even COVID right now, trying to get to like a census of what's going on actually isn't practical. I said in my room last night at the round table that it's not productive to go looking for scientific answers in the media. It just isn't. Mm-hmm. And that can be very frustrating because you go, if you're not in the field, well, how am I going to get what's going on? You have to wait. Mm-hmm. Because eventually, even in a situation like this, if you think about the most obtuse idea that we've been misled about how severe COVID is, with time, if that is the case, the things that are happening in the world will tell us. But it takes time. So as individual scientists, I encourage us to try to give the best information we have available, honestly, when we're called upon to report. It's very challenging not to say what we think people want us to say. And a lot of that may be going on now with some of the folks, the scientists who are leading the public discussion of this right now. But again, I really subscribe to the idea that although we may not live to see it, what's really going on will eventually emerge. It can't be otherwise. We can disguise it, we can be confused about it, but the way science works, which keeps pegging away, plodding away at it, eventually truth, a better representation of truth emerges.
It reminds me very much of what people say about democracy. It's a messy process. It's like making sausage. You don't really want to watch it happening. It's just really messy. And you'd like something else, but there really aren't any other alternatives at the moment to doing it the way we're doing it. So it has something of that. I just want to emphasize that coming in on the chat, and I think everyone's seeing this, there are some very interesting comments, more than questions, that are coming in on the chat. And notice people are noticing that the conversation we're having today is going on in departments, at universities around, as well as in corporations. This is a live and fruitful conversation that's happening, everywhere, and we're certainly part of it. I'm going to turn in a little different, very different direction for just a second, because this went by, and you're talking about how we interact with others and in our families in particular. And you said, I think, at one point that maybe your wife had said something about your children not being an experiment. And then I see Ruth Miller raised her hand and said that, yes, they are. Children are an experiment. And that kind of tells us about something about our lives, right?
So, Ruth, thank you for that support. Yeah, because we don't know where they're going to end up, right? And we are experimenting with how we're based on the information we've got. And so, yeah, they are, I think. However, that being said, they're more than that. I think it's what my wife would say. They're more than experiments, and we have to recognize that as well. The most difficult, so in science, the most difficult experimental subject are human beings. We're so nuanced. There's so much stuff going on in terms of how we bring bias, uncertainty, unpredictability, all of those things. And so these disciplines where human beings are the subjects of the research in some way, including being a parent, are just inherently more complicated and complex to do. Yeah, but yeah. I'll just tell you, upstairs right now, my younger daughter's here now. She better not hear me refer to her as an experiment.
Right. James, I had a colleague who said in a faculty meeting one time that his wife just really disliked when he came home from a faculty meeting, because he said, you come home to dinner, we have them late in the day, and she says, you come home to dinner and you treat our family like a problem to be solved. You're so analytical. You just park it, would you please? We're family here. So a bit of ground rules. I had another question, and I'm searching for it. It was one that I had created before, and I'll just tell you what it is. Thinking about young people, because I know you advise both high school, university students. You're into graduate students, postdocs. You have some links in, even though you're not every day in the academy. You're adjunct at places, so you interact. This is a very challenging world for a graduate student, a graduate of any of our level, a challenging world to enter. And you've been in that world in asymmetrics. That's not the academy, it's the world of business. And science and business are really much closer linked today, perhaps, than we have idealized them in the past. So what advice, because entering into a business proposition as a young person right out of graduate school, perhaps with debt, perhaps not, I mean, these are risky opportunities. And what advice are you giving to young people today about that world that you inhabit?
Yeah, so it turns out that most of the advising that I'm doing currently are actually graduate students who are interested in coming into entrepreneurship and business. So a lot of my advising right now is really around how best to do that, not whether to do it.
Okay.
Back in my academic days as a professor, I was at MIT, and a large fraction of our students went into industry and built companies. And in those cases sometimes there was an issue of providing, counsel about what's the better or best direction. I said all that to say something very simple. My advice to students is always pretty much the same, no matter where they are in their training or what they think they want to do. It's always the same, which is this. If you have the blessing to follow your interests. That's what you should do. Now, you can then ask, given that interest, what would happen if I went in this direction? What would happen if I went in that? I say, go talk to people who are doing that. Ask them about their experience. It's almost the same thing when you're trying to, I'm doing this thing now called NSF I-Core with students. It helps students to figure out how to develop businesses around their technologies. And one of the things we do there is we do a lot of what's called customer discovery. It's going out and finding out what customers' experience is, because that helps you determine how you're going to develop your product. It's the same thing with planning your life. Go out and discover what people in the areas that you think you're of interest in, what their experience is, and see if that's an experience that you might want to have. But follow your interests.
Right. Well, you've got a really practical one I want to ask you about, and it's with asymmetrics. I was on your webpage, and I saw several things as I looked you up and what you're doing. And within the last several years, you've offered a free trial for stem cell counting service. Got a nice little video. It's really accessible. Even a field ecologist can understand what it is the challenge that you're facing out there. And it seems really powerful. But I was curious because you're giving away. This is a business move, right? And a proposition. You're giving away free stem cell counts. That seems counterintuitive in a kind of business world. So, are there special challenges in launching a new technology like the one that you have in this area that have driven you to do this kind of a marketing tool?
Yeah, so I'll try to present this in a more general way instead of plugging my company. But it boils down to this. One of the biggest challenges with a new technology, even when you're pretty confident you've developed something that people need, is that they've been getting along without it.
No.
They have all sorts of ways of addressing it, and they may not even know about it.
Right.
So one of the goals you do in business is to just do education and provide access. We want people to count stem cells.
Yeah.
We think it's pretty important. If you're getting a stem cell treatment, you need to know the stem cell dose. But just because probably most people would agree with me on that, that doesn't mean anybody's going to start doing it because they've been doing something else.
Sure.
So we decided that it was worth it to us to simply, as a first stage, make it available to everybody.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing. At some point, of course, we have to start recovering costs at some point. Mm-hmm. But right now, best thing is I just want people to use it. I say to my wife, and I don't know if she actually likes hearing this or not, if this company never makes a penny and the world starts counting stem cells, I'm going to be a happy guy. Because that's what I really want. I think this is important, needs to be out there. I just want people, if I could get a grant where I never had to worry about making money, I just would make this available to everybody. That's what we'd be doing.
James, that goes right to the heart of what I wanted to get to as we bring this to a close today. And that is that Christians have a way of looking at questions in the sciences differently, just as you've looked at business differently. And what you've just described for business is what I've heard Christian business schools talk about. The purpose of business is not to make a profit. Profit is a necessary condition to staying in business. You have to have some money coming in so you can stay in business. But that's not what your goal is. Your goal is to serve people. And I find that Christian men and women, when they look at their discipline of faith, discipline of science, and over here on commerce side, we look at things, differently. You ask different questions. And if that's one of the things we could do, oftentimes when we think about our witness to the community, we're trying to think about some formula. Is it the four spiritual laws? Was I overt enough? Did I make that? No, it's you are a witness. It's who you are. It's how you do what you do.
So, John, let me just add one more. I want to share one more thing with the group here, because what we're doing in the company is what I had hoped to do as a professor at a university. Yeah. And when I couldn't get a position there anymore, the idea came to me that this is a way to keep working on the mission that I think we have in the world, which is to bring this type of capability to stem cell medicine.
Sure.
So the company is a vehicle to be able to continue to do that. Yeah. So.
Thank you, James. That is a wonderful way to bring these this is the second of our inaugural Brown Baggers, to a close today. I'm going to turn it over to Vicki. She'll need to unmute herself. And I want to thank you very much. I'm probably seeing some clapping hands that are showing up here and some things like this, because we really appreciate what you've done today. Thanks for giving your time here for us. And Vicki?
Thank you, James. That was just as good today as it was a year ago. And James has become a good friend of mine and of the ASA. And in fact, we're neighbors here in Boston. And it was, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago that he took the train up to the North Shore here, and we shared famous Essex fried clams together. We had met 2 years ago, as he mentioned, at the Gordon Roundtable. And then again last summer when he was a plenary at Wheaton. I remember being so impressed with the fact that James fully engaged in the whole weekend of the conference. He was there from the start to the finish, getting to know people over meals and attending many of the talks and the student sessions. And he mentioned earlier about being in the present, and he definitely was in the present there. And as he said, he even became an ASA member, so he's one of us now, and his participation and involvement has grown really quickly. In fact, James was scheduled to speak here in the Boston area at our Gordon College student chapter. We were going to do a roundtable event in April when COVID hit. And so that got postponed, but we'll do it again down the road. And speaking of COVID, when it became real and we realized here in the ASA that going to San Diego for our annual meeting wasn't possible, the first time in 75 years that we've had to cancel it, we quickly pivoted to our new reality. And I mentioned this on the Tuesday Brown Bagger. Our team thought that this Summer Something series would be a great and creative way to bring many aspects of the annual meeting that we all love online. And so our week is off to a great start, seeing many faces again. We had our prayer and praise session on Monday, and then Tuesday we had a Brown Bagger. John mentioned the Fellows Dinner last night, which was fantastic. And part of our new reality is this business model that now has been flipped upside down, as you can imagine. Like many nonprofits, we're in the process of repositioning our meetings and trying to bring them online and repositioning our budget too. And we've made a conscious decision not to monetize these meetings this week for a variety of reasons, but we are encouraging and gladly accepting donations to help offset our costs and support our budget. So if you feel so led to make a gift, we'd certainly be grateful. And thank you to so many of you that do faithfully support the ASA and have sent in gifts over the last 3 to 4 months. Really appreciate that. We've got a few more events left for the remainder of this week. I just want to bring them to your attention. I'm sure you're getting the daily devotionals coming into your inbox every morning. They've really been blessing me, and I hope they've been blessing you too. We have the State of the ASA, Friday night, 7 o'clock Eastern time, where the leadership team will talk about where we've come and where we're going. So I encourage you to join us. We're going to have a student testimonial. Veronica, who I'm seeing on this call, is going to speak, and you'll want to hear that. And then we're going to bring our ice cream social, which is also a favorite of the ASA annual meeting. We're going to bring that online right after the State of the ASA. And then Saturday afternoon here in the East Coast at 1 o'clock, we've got our Emerging Scholars Network Early Career Student Mini Conference. So you're welcome to register for that. That'll be a wonderful time. We have Praveen Sethupathy from Cornell as our plenary. And then immediately following that, the Christian Women in Science are going to do an after party. And then we're going to wrap it all up Sunday morning with an ASA-style worship service. So we have Sean McDonough from Gordon Conwell Seminary will be speaking. We've got some special music. We've got a children's sermon, so bring the whole family. The intention is for everybody to bring their families and come Sunday morning. It's always a favorite of our annual meetings is to worship together. All this information is on our website, so feel free to take a look there. All the links can be found there, and certainly feel free to bring a friend, a colleague, your pastor, a student, because the more the merrier. And I've loved watching all the interaction going on in the chat. It's almost like we're together, so that's been really neat to see. If there's any of you that aren't ASA members, I wrote it in the chat, we'd be happy to connect with you. So feel free to put your email in the chat and we'll reach out to you and connect. So enjoy your afternoons. Thank you for being with us, and God bless.